The rain hammered against the windshield like 1,000 angry fists, each drop a small betrayal in a day already thick with them. Jack Hartley sat motionless in his Ford F-150, parked 3 houses down from what used to be home. The papers were still warm in his hand, fresh ink on his signature, 25 years of marriage reduced to legal jargon in a judge's stamp. The house looked the same as it had that morning. Same blue shutters, same rose bush by the mailbox that he'd planted when Daniel was born. But it wasn't his anymore. None of it was. He was 52 years old, a contractor by trade, a Marine by training, and as of 3 hours ago, officially divorced. The rain kept falling. He kept sitting. Somewhere in that house, Jennifer was probably packing the rest of his things into boxes marked with his name in her careful handwriting. 25 years, and it all fit in boxes. His phone buzzed against the console. He almost didn't look, almost let it ring into the void where most calls from numbers he didn't recognize went to die. But something made him glance down. The area code was Montana, 406. He hadn't seen that number in over a decade. He answered without saying hello. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who introduced himself as Richard Moss, attorney at law, calling from Missoula. There had been a death. Marcus Hartley, Jack's uncle, the only brother of Jack's father, and a man Jack had met exactly twice in his entire life. Once at his father's funeral 10 years ago, where Marcus had stood at the back of the church and left before the reception. And once, years before that, at a family reunion, Marcus had arrived at drunk and left angry, shouting something about lies and cowards and a family that chose comfort over truth. The attorney's voice was steady, professional, almost bored. Marcus had passed 3 weeks ago. Liver failure complicated by years of what the medical examiner diplomatically called lifestyle factors. He had no wife, no children, no close friends that anyone could locate. But he had left a will. And in that will, he had left everything to Jack. Everything turned out to be a safety deposit box at a bank in Missoula and a property deed to a cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains. The attorney asked if Jack wanted to fly out to handle the estate or if he'd prefer to sign papers remotely and let the state auction everything off. Jack looked at the house that used to be his, at the rain that wouldn't stop, at the empty passenger seat where his wife used to sit and his son used to argue about music and life had used to make sense. He told the attorney he'd be there in 2 days. The drive from Portland to Montana took him through rain, then fog, then high desert, then mountains that rose like the bones of something ancient and still dreaming. He drove with the windows cracked, letting the cold air keep him awake, and he didn't turn on the radio because silence felt more honest. Somewhere past Coeur d'Alene, the landscape started to look like the postcards his father used to keep in a drawer and never explain. Big sky country, that's what they called it. Jack understood why. The sky didn't just stretch overhead, it swallowed you. His father had never talked about Montana, never talked about Marcus, never talked about anything that happened before Jack was born, really. Edward Hartley had been a quiet man, the kind who worked with his hands and believed that feelings were things you buried deep and covered with work. He'd been a machinist at a Boeing plant outside Seattle for 37 years. He'd taught Jack how to use a level, how to frame a wall, how to shake a man's hand like you meant it. But he'd never taught Jack about his own father, Samuel Hartley, the man who had vanished in 1954 and left a hole in the family that no one ever talked about. Jack knew the story only in pieces, fragments overheard at family gatherings when the adults thought the kids weren't listening. Samuel Hartley had been some kind of engineer, Army maybe. He'd come back from the war, married a local girl, had 2 sons, Edward and Marcus. And then one winter, he'd walked into the Montana wilderness and never walked back out. Some said it was suicide. Some said he just kept walking until the cold took him. Edward had been 12, Marcus had been 8, and neither of them ever forgave their father for leaving. Jack pulled into Missoula just before sunset on the second day. The town was bigger than he'd expected, tucked into a valley where 5 rivers met and the mountains pressed in close like they were keeping secrets. He checked into a motel that smelled like pine cleaner and old carpet, took a shower hot enough to burn, and slept for 12 hours straight. The attorney's office was downtown, in a brick building that had probably been there since Montana was still a territory. Richard Moss turned out to be younger than his voice suggested, maybe 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of handshake that said he'd rather be anywhere else. He laid out the paperwork with the efficiency of a man who did this 3 times a week. Marcus Hartley's estate consisted of $4,300 in a checking account, a 1987 Toyota Corolla with a blown transmission, and the contents of safety deposit box number 217 at First Security Bank. The cabin, Moss explained, was located approximately 40 miles northeast of Missoula, accessible by Forest Service roads that were only partially maintained. The deed was clear, no liens, no disputes. It had been in the Hartley family since 1946, though Marcus had been the only one to visit it in the last 30 years. Moss slid a sealed manila envelope across his desk. It was thick, letter-sized, and across the front, someone had written in black marker, "For Jack, open alone." Jack stared at it for a long moment. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, like they'd been written by someone whose hands no longer obeyed orders. He took the envelope. He signed the papers. He accepted the keys to the safety deposit box and a second set of keys on a ring that looked military, the kind that might have opened footlockers in another lifetime. He thanked the attorney and walked back out into the Montana afternoon, where the sun was bright and cold and the mountains watched him like they'd been waiting. The bank was 2 blocks away. The safety deposit box was in the basement, behind a heavy door that required 2 keys to open. The bank employee, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a name tag that said Dorothy, led him to a small private room and left him alone with the box. Inside, he found a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, a military compass, brass and heavy, with initials scratched into the back. SH 1945. Normandy, a hand-drawn map on what looked like old surveyor's paper, marked with elevations and trail markers in a single X in red ink. And a USB drive, the cheap plastic kind you could buy at any drugstore, with a strip of masking tape across it that read, "Watch this first." Jack sat there in the fluorescent silence of the bank basement, holding his grandfather's compass in one hand and his uncle's final message in the other, and for the first time since the divorce papers were signed, he felt something other than numb. He felt called. The motel room had a television older than his marriage and a desk that wobbled when he set his laptop on it. He plugged in the USB drive and waited while the computer recognized it. There was only one file, a video, recorded 3 months ago according to the timestamp. When he hit play, his uncle's face filled the screen. Marcus Hartley looked like a man who'd been dying for a while and had made peace with it. His skin was the color of old newspaper. His eyes were yellow at the edges, liver failure written in every line of his face. He was sitting in what looked like a hospital room, propped up on pillows, wearing a gown that had seen better days. But his voice when he spoke was clear. "Jack, if you're watching this, I'm dead. Probably been dead a few weeks, knowing how these things go. I don't have much time, so I'm going to say this straight. Everything they told you about your grandfather, about Samuel Hartley, was a lie. He didn't abandon the family. He didn't lose his mind and walk into the woods to die. He ran because they were going to kill him, and they would have killed all of us if he'd stayed." Marcus coughed, a wet sound that rattled in his chest. Someone off camera handed him a cup of water. He sipped it and continued. "I was 8 years old when he left. I barely remember him. But your father, Eddie, he was 12. Old enough to remember. Old enough to hate him for leaving. And Eddie carried that hate until the day he died. And he passed it down to you like it was some kind of inheritance. But it was built on a lie, Jack. A lie I helped keep alive because I was too scared to tell the truth. Samuel Hartley wasn't a coward. He was a soldier. Army Corps of Engineers, served under Patton, built bridges across half of Europe while people were shooting at him. After the war, he came home and got hired by a mining company called Resolve. They wanted someone who could read land, who could survey and dig and tell them where the silver was. And Samuel was good at it. Too good. Because he found something they didn't want him to find. Marcus paused. His hands were shaking now, trembling against the thin hospital blanket. He found uranium, Jack. This was 1948, 1949, right when the government was paying top dollar for anything radioactive. The Cold War was starting. Everyone wanted the bomb, and Resolve, they found a deposit in the Bitterroot Mountains that could have made them millions. But here's the thing, the land wasn't theirs, it was federal. And they were mining it anyway, secretly, selling the uranium under the table and dumping the waste wherever they felt like it. Samuel found out, and he was going to report it. He had evidence, core samples, Internal memos, photographs. He had everything. And then one night, men in suits showed up at our house. They didn't knock. They just stood outside in the yard wearing gas masks. Like they wanted us to see them, like they wanted us to know what they could do. 2 weeks later, Samuel packed a bag and disappeared. Left a note that said he was sorry, that he loved us, that he had to go. Eddie found the note. He burned it. He told me Dad was a coward who ran away. And I believed him because I was 8 and I didn't know any better. Marcus's voice cracked. He looked away from the camera, blinking hard. But I knew the truth, Jack. I've known it for 30 years. Because in 1987, I got a job as a geologist for a company that turned out to be a subsidiary of Resolve. And I found files, old files, buried in archives that no one was supposed to see. Files about Samuel Hartley, about the whistleblower who had to be silenced, about the accident that was planned but never executed because he ran first. I should have said something. I should have told Eddie. I should have told you. But I was scared, Jack. Scared that if I opened my mouth, the same people who made your grandfather disappear would make me disappear too. So I stayed quiet. I drank. I avoided the family. I became the crazy uncle no one wanted around. And now I'm dying and the fear doesn't matter anymore. Marcus leaned forward, his yellow eyes locked on the camera. There's a cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains, cabin number 12 on the old Forest Service maps. Samuel built it himself after the war. That's where he went when he disappeared. That's where he hid the evidence. It's all still there, Jack. 70 years later, and it's still there. I know because I went looking 10 years ago and I found it. But I didn't have the guts to do anything with it. You do. You're a Marine. You're Eddie's son. You're Samuel's blood. And you deserve to know the truth about the man whose name you carry. The cabin's locked. I'm leaving you the key. There's a map in the deposit box. Follow it. Find what he left behind and finish what he started. Because Resolve is still out there, Jack. They changed their name, went corporate, got respectable. But they're still mining on land that isn't theirs, still dumping poison in our water, still killing people and calling it progress. Samuel Hartley didn't run because he was weak. He ran because he was a father who loved his children more than he loved his pride. And he spent the rest of his life alone in those mountains, holding on to evidence and hoping that someday, someone in his family would be brave enough to use it. Be that someone, Jack. The video ended. The screen went black. Jack sat in the motel room, staring at his own reflection in the laptop screen, and felt the weight of 70 years settle onto his shoulders like a rucksack full of stones. He looked at the compass on the desk, at the map with its red X, at the keys that might unlock a door no one had opened in decades. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear, and the stars looked close enough to touch. Jack Hartley had driven here looking for distraction, something to fill the empty space where his marriage used to be. But what he'd found was a mission. And if 20 years in the Marine Corps had taught him anything, it was this. When you're given a mission, you see it through, no matter what. He closed the laptop. He packed his bag. And in the morning, before the sun came up, he loaded his truck with everything he'd need for a trip into the wilderness. Water, food, a first aid kit, a Glock 19 that he'd carried since his concealed carry permit came through, a military-grade flashlight, rope, a compass he didn't need because he had his grandfather's, and a sense of purpose that felt almost like peace. The drive into the Bitterroot Mountains took him on roads that got narrower with every mile. Paved highway became gravel, became dirt, became something that was barely a road at all, just 2 ruts through the pine trees where other trucks had gone before. The GPS on his phone lost signal somewhere around mile 20. He didn't care. He had the map. He had the compass. And he had something he hadn't felt in years, clarity. The landscape changed as he climbed. Ponderosa pines gave way to lodgepole and the air got thinner, colder, sharp in his lungs like breathing through broken glass. He passed a sign that said entering Bitterroot National Forest. And then he didn't pass anything for another hour except trees and rocks and the occasional elk that watched him from the tree line with eyes that held no judgment. He stopped for gas at a station so small it didn't have a name, just a single pump and a building that looked like it had been standing since before Montana was a state. The man behind the counter was old, maybe 70, with a face like carved wood and eyes that had seen things he didn't talk about. Jack paid for the gas and asked about the road to Cabin 12. The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he said in a voice like gravel shifting, "You Hartley's kin?" Jack nodded. The man shook his head slowly. "Last man went up that road didn't come back down. That was, 10 years ago. Before that, no one had been up there since the 50s. Jack waited. The old man rang up the gas. "Road's still there, barely. You got four-wheel drive. You'll make it most of the way. After that, you're walking. 3 miles, maybe 4. Trails marked if you know what you're looking for." He paused. "You know what you're looking for, son?" Jack thought about his uncle's yellow eyes, about his grandfather's compass, about a marriage that ended and a life that felt like it was waiting for something to begin. He said, "I'm starting to." The old man nodded like that was the answer enough. "Watch yourself up there. Mountains don't care who your granddaddy was." Jack drove until the road became impassable. Then he parked the truck in a clearing and continued on foot. The trail was there, just like the old man said, marked with faded blazes on tree trunks and cairns of stacked stones that someone had built a long time ago. The air was cold enough to see his breath, and somewhere far off, a hawk screamed. He'd been walking for maybe 2 hours when he saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by pines that had grown tall enough to shade it from the worst of the sun. It was built from logs, hand-hewn, fitted together with the precision of someone who knew what they were doing. The roof was shingled with cedar that had gone silver with age. The windows were boarded over, and the door was a slab of oak that looked like it could stop a bullet. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing and felt something he couldn't name. Not quite grief, not quite recognition, something older than both. He walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on the mix of pine needles and old snow that hadn't melted yet. There was a porch, just a small one, and on the porch was a chair that had weathered into the color of bone. He imagined his grandfather sitting in that chair, looking out at these trees, holding secrets that weighed more than stone. The lock on the door was old, military issue, the kind they used on ammunition boxes. Jack took the key from his pocket, the one Marcus had left in the deposit box, and slid it into the lock. It turned with a sound like a sigh. The door opened. The air that spilled out was cold and dry and smelled like time itself. Jack stepped inside and let his eyes adjust to the dimness. The cabin was a single room, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. There was a wood stove in one corner, a cot with a wool blanket folded on it, a table made from split logs. Shelves lined the walls, and on those shelves were books, engineering manuals, field guides to Montana wildlife, a Bible, a copy of The Old Man and the Sea with a bookmark still stuck halfway through. And in the corner beneath the only window was a trunk. It was military issue, olive drab, with brass corners that had tarnished to green. Stenciled on the top in faded paint were the words, S.J. Samuel Hartley, U.S. Army. Jack crossed the room and knelt in front of it. His hands were steady. Everything in him was steady. This was what he'd come for. This was what 70 years had been waiting for. The trunk had a combination lock. 3 numbers. He tried his grandfather's birthday. Nothing. He tried his father's birthday. Nothing. He sat back on his heels and thought. Then he tried June 6, 1944. D-Day, the day the Allied forces landed in Normandy and Samuel Hartley had been there, building bridges under fire. The lock clicked open. Inside the trunk, laid out with the precision of a man who'd been trained to pack under pressure, was a life that no one had been allowed to see. A uniform, Army Corps of Engineers, technical sergeant stripes still bright against the olive wool, a purple heart in a velvet case, a photograph of a young man standing next to a tank, grinning like he'd just won the war. Underneath the photo, someone had written in pencil, "Sam and Patton's boys, somewhere in France, 1940. But beneath the uniform, beneath the medals and the photographs was something else, a journal. Leather-bound, the pages yellowed but intact, and when Jack opened it to the first page, he saw his grandfather's handwriting, neat and precise, the handwriting of an engineer who measured twice and cut once. The first entry was dated January 3rd, 1940. Came home today. The war's over, but it doesn't feel over. Carolyn says I talk in my sleep. Eddie asked me what France was like. I told him it was far away. That's all he needs to know. That's all anyone needs to know. Jack turned the pages slowly. The entries were sparse at first, just notes about weather and work and the small details of a life trying to become normal again. But then, in 1947, the tone changed. Started work with Resolve Mining today. They want me to survey the Bitterroot Range. Looking for silver, they say. The pay's good, better than anything else around here. I told Caroline we could buy a house in town. She smiled for the first time since I got back. And then, months later, found something today that doesn't make sense. The core samples show traces of uranium. A lot of it, more than should be here. I asked Thompson about it. He said, don't worry about it, just mark the silver deposits. But the uranium's on federal land. If they're mining it, they're breaking about 6 different laws. The entries got shorter after that, more tense. May 15, 1948. Took samples to the assay office in Butte. Confirmed. Uranium oxide, high grade. Resolve is selling it. I found shipping receipts. They're moving it through a shell company in Nevada. This isn't legal. This is fraud. September 3rd, 1948. Told Thompson I was going to report what I found. He said that would be a mistake. Said there are people who wouldn't like that. I told him I wasn't asking for permission. He said I should think about my family. November 22nd, 1948. They came to the house last night. Didn't knock. Just stood in the yard, 3 of them, wearing gas masks. Carolyn saw them through the window and screamed. Eddie came running, asked what was wrong. I told him it was nothing. Told him to go back to bed. But he saw them too. He asked me why those men didn't have eyes. I didn't have an answer. December 1st, 1948. I'm moving the evidence, all of it. Core samples, memos, shipping records, everything. I've built a cache in the mountains. Old engineer trick, reinforced waterproof, hidden. If anything happens to me, it'll still be there. Someone will find it, someday. March 15th, 1949. They killed Hendricks, called it a car accident, but I saw the brake lines. I saw what they did. I went to the sheriff. He told me I was seeing things. Told me Resolve is the biggest employer in the county and I should be grateful to have a job. I'm not grateful. I'm terrified. And then the final entry, dated November 28th, 1953. I'm leaving tonight. Not because I'm a coward, because if I stay, they'll kill me in front of my sons. I've seen what they do to people who know too much. I've seen the bodies they call accidents. I'm taking the evidence to the cabin. I'm going to disappear. Let them think I ran. Let them think I broke. But the truth stays hidden until someone brave enough comes looking. Eddie will hate me. Marcus will forget me. Caroline will mourn me, but they'll live, and that's all that matters. If anyone finds this, if anyone from my blood ever reads these words, know this. I didn't abandon you. I protected you, and I'm sorry it had to be this way. Jack read the last line 3 times. His hands were shaking. Not from cold, from something deeper. He set the journal down and looked through the rest of the trunk. There were maps, detailed survey maps with elevations and mineral deposits marked in colored pencil. There were photographs of mining operations, men in hard hats standing next to equipment that looked primitive by modern standards. There were core samples, small cylinders of rock sealed in glass tubes, each one labeled with coordinates and dates. And at the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, was a folded map. When Jack opened it, he recognized the terrain, the Bitterroot Range, the same mountains he'd just hiked through. But this map had something the others didn't, a trail marked in red ink leading deeper into the wilderness. And at the end of that trail, a single word written in his grandfather's careful hand, cash. Jack sat back against the cabin wall and let it all sink in. His grandfather hadn't been a coward, hadn't been weak, hadn't abandoned his family because he couldn't handle the responsibility. He'd been a soldier who saw a war coming to his doorstep and made the hardest choice a father can make. He'd traded his name for his son's safety, his reputation for their lives. And now, 70 years later, that choice was sitting in Jack's hands in the form of evidence that could bring down a company that had grown into something bigger than anyone in 1953 could have imagined. Jack stood up, his knees cracked, his back ached. He was 52 years old, recently divorced, with a son who barely spoke to him and a life that felt like it was held together with duct tape and good intentions. But he was also a Marine, and Marines didn't leave a mission unfinished. He gathered the journal, the maps, and the photographs. He left the uniform and the medals where they were. Those belonged here in this place his grandfather had built with his own hands, but the evidence was coming with him. He stepped out onto the porch and locked the cabin door behind him. The sun was starting to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple that looked almost unreal. The air was getting colder. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Jack was about to start back down the trail when he heard it. The sound of an engine, faint but getting closer. He froze, every instinct from 20 years of military service suddenly online and screaming. Headlights appeared through the trees, not the soft glow of regular headlights. The hard white glare of LED light bars, the kind people put on trucks when they wanted to see everything and didn't care who knew they were coming. Jack moved without thinking, stepping off the porch and into the tree line. He watched as a black Chevy Suburban rolled into the clearing, big and new and completely out of place. 3 men got out. They wore suits, not the cheap kind, the kind that cost more than Jack made in a month. And they moved like people who'd been trained to move, efficient and alert, scanning the cabin and the surrounding trees with the kind of attention that said they were looking for something specific. One of them pulled out a radio and spoke into it, his voice too low for Jack to hear the words. But he heard the tone, calm, professional, reporting. The man said, "Confirm activity at the cabin, standing by." Jack's hand moved to the Glock on his hip. He didn't draw it, not yet, but his thumb rested on the snap of the holster, and every muscle in his body was ready. The 3 men didn't approach the cabin. They just stood there, watching it, waiting. And Jack Hartley, kneeling in the pine needles with his grandfather's secrets in his backpack and 70 years of silence about to break wide open, realized that whatever his uncle had warned him about, whatever had made Samuel Hartley disappear into these mountains, it was still here, still watching, still waiting. And now it knew he'd come. Jack stayed in the tree line for 20 minutes, barely breathing, watching the 3 men who watched the cabin. They didn't move like civilians. Every gesture was economical, purposeful, the kind of movement that came from training that went deeper than muscle memory. One of them walked the perimeter of the clearing, eyes scanning the ground like he was reading a language most people didn't know existed. Another stood by the Suburban with his hand resting on his hip in a way that told Jack there was a weapon under that expensive suit jacket. The 3rd man, the one who'd used the radio, stood perfectly still on the cabin porch, staring at the door like he could see through it. The sun was almost down now. The temperature was dropping fast, the way it does in the mountains when the light goes. Jack's breath came out in small clouds. He controlled it, slowed it, used the breathing techniques they taught him in sniper school 20 years ago. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 4. Repeat until your heartbeat was something you could count instead of something that controlled you. The men on the porch pulled out a flashlight, one of those tactical LED jobs that could light up a football field. He swept it across the cabin's boarded windows, across the door, across the porch where Samuel Hartley had probably sat 1,000 times watching these same mountains. Then he turned and said something to the others. Jack couldn't hear the words, but he saw the body language. A decision had been made. All 3 of them got back into the Suburban. The engine started with a low rumble that seemed too loud in the wilderness quiet. The headlights swung around, painting the trees in harsh white, and for one terrible second, Jack thought they were going to drive right toward where he was hidden. But they didn't. They headed back down the trail, the red glow of taillights fading between the pines until there was nothing left but darkness and the sound of wind in the branches. Jack waited another 10 minutes, then 20. When he was certain they weren't coming back, he moved out of the tree line and stood in the clearing, listening to the night. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Closer, something small moved through the underbrush. The cabin sat silent and dark, keeping its secrets the way it had for 70 years. He couldn't go back the way he'd come. If those men were watching the main trail, he'd walk right into them. But Jack Hartley hadn't spent 2 decades in the Marines without learning how to navigate hostile territory. He pulled out his grandfather's compass, oriented himself to the map he'd memorized, and started walking north through country that had probably never seen a human footprint. The hike out took him 4 hours in the dark. He used his flashlight sparingly, only when he absolutely had to, moving by starlight and moonshadow, and the kind of intuition that came from years of trusting your instincts over your eyes. He crossed a creek that was running high with snowmelt, the water so cold it made his bones ache. He climbed over deadfall and squeezed between rock faces, and twice had to backtrack when the terrain got too steep. But he kept moving, always north, always away from the trail those men would be watching. When he finally made it back to his truck, it was past midnight. He stood in the trees for a long time, making sure the clearing was empty, making sure no one was waiting. Then he moved fast. He threw his gear in the bed, started the engine, and drove without headlights until he was a mile down the mountain. Only then did he flip on the lights and let himself breathe. He drove through the night, fighting exhaustion with gas station coffee and the kind of adrenaline that came from knowing people in expensive suits were looking for you. He didn't go back to the motel in Missoula. That felt too obvious, too easy. Instead, he drove south, putting distance between himself and the Bitterroot Range until he found a truck stop outside of Hamilton where the rigs idled all night and nobody cared who you were or why you looked like you'd been dragged through hell backward. He parked in the back of the lot, killed the engine, and sat there while his hands shook on the steering wheel. Not from fear, from something else, something that felt like the moment right before a firefight, when you knew things were about to get loud and violent and there was no backing out. He pulled out his phone. No signal. He'd have to wait until morning to make the calls he needed to make. He locked the doors, reclined the seat as far as it would go, and closed his eyes. Sleep came hard and full of dreams about men in gas masks standing in his father's yard. Morning broke cold and clear. Jack cleaned up as best he could in the truck stop bathroom, shaved with a disposable razor, changed into clean clothes. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who was 52 going on 100. But he also saw something else. Purpose. For the first time since the divorce papers were signed, he had a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just habit. He bought breakfast at the diner attached to the truck stop. Eggs, toast, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime last week. The waitress was young, maybe 20, with tired eyes and a name tag that said Crystal. She poured his coffee without asking and left him alone with his thoughts. He ate mechanically, fueling the body without tasting the food, while his mind worked through the tactical situation. He had evidence, good evidence, his grandfather's journal, maps, photographs, core samples, but evidence without context was just old paper and rocks. He needed someone who understood what he was looking at, someone who knew the history of resolve mining and wouldn't dismiss him as a crazy man with a family grudge. His uncle Marcus had mentioned a name in the video, Diana Frost, investigative journalist, the only one still tracking resolved from murder. Jack pulled out his phone and searched the name. She had a website, bare bones and functional, listing articles she'd written about corporate corruption, environmental crimes, whistleblower cases. Her bio said she'd been doing this for 30 years. Her photo showed a woman in her late 50s with gray hair cut short and eyes that looked like they'd seen through a lot of lies. There was a contact form. Jack thought about using it, then decided against it. If Resolve had people watching his uncle's cabin, they probably had people watching anyone who'd ever written about them. He needed to be smarter than a digital trail. He paid for breakfast and walked out to the parking lot where the sun was burning off the morning chill. His phone finally had signal. He made a call to the one person in Montana he thought he might be able to trust, Sheriff Thomas Brennan. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered, rough with sleep and cigarettes. "This is Brennan." Jack said, "Sheriff, my name is Jack Hartley. I need to talk to you about my grandfather, Samuel Hartley, and about Resolve Mining." There was a long silence on the other end, long enough that Jack thought the call had dropped. Then Brennan said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, "Where are you right now?" "Truck stop outside Hamilton. Stay there. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Don't talk to anyone. Don't use your credit cards. Don't do anything that leaves a digital footprint. You understand me?" Jack understood. He said so. Brennan hung up without saying goodbye. Jack waited in the truck with the doors locked and the Glock on the seat beside him. He watched every vehicle that pulled into the lot, watched for black Suburbans with tinted windows, watched for men in suits who moved like they'd been trained to kill people efficiently. 38 minutes later, a dusty Ford Explorer with county sheriff plates pulled up next to his truck. The man who got out was about 55, built solid, with the kind of face that had spent a lot of time squinting into the sun. He wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and a badge clipped to his belt. No uniform, no hat. He looked like someone who'd been called out of bed and hadn't bothered to make it official. He walked up to Jack's window and waited for Jack to roll it down. Brennan said, "You look like your grandfather. Same eyes." Jack said, "You knew him?" "No, but I knew the case." He gestured toward the diner. Let's talk inside. Coffee's terrible, but it's private this time of morning. They took a booth in the back, away from the windows. Brennan ordered coffee and didn't touch it when it came. He just sat there, hands folded on the table, looking at Jack like he was trying to decide something important. Finally, he said, I was FBI for 22 years before I took this job. Did organized crime, public corruption, the kind of cases that make you real popular at cocktail parties. In 1987, I was a young agent full of ideals, thought I could change the world. I got assigned to a task force looking into resolve mining. This was back when they were still calling themselves Resolve. Before they went corporate and changed their name 6 times and became the kind of company that has lawyers in every state capital. He paused, looking down at his coffee like it might have answers. We found evidence of fraud, environmental crimes, bribery. We found shell companies and offshore accounts in a pattern of whistleblowers who ended up dead in ways that looked like accidents, but weren't. And we found your grandfather's name in old files. Samuel Hartley, reported as a missing person in 1954, dismissed as a drunk who walked into the mountains and froze. But when we dug deeper, we found witness statements that had been buried. People who said men in suits came asking about him, people who saw things they weren't supposed to see. Jack leaned forward. What happened to the investigation? Brennan's jaw tightened. It got shut down. Orders from above, way above, and I mean Pentagon above. Turns out Resolve had become a defense contractor in the 60s. They were building tunnels for missile silos, doing underground work for projects that didn't have names. They had friends in places you can't subpoena. The case got closed. I got transferred to Alaska. Spent 5 years investigating fishing violations while the people who killed your grandfather kept getting richer. He finally looked up, met Jack's eyes. I've been waiting 30 years for someone from the Hartley family to come asking questions. I was starting to think it would never happen. So when you called this morning saying his name, I knew exactly what you'd found. Jack pulled the journal out of his backpack and set it on the table between them. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Brennan opened it carefully, like he was handling something sacred. He read the first page, then the last page. Then he closed it and pushed it back across the table. He said, as a sheriff, I should tell you to turn this over to the proper authorities and let the system handle it. As someone who spent 5 years in Alaska counting salmon because I tried to do exactly that, I'm going to tell you something different. The system is compromised, has been for decades. If you hand this to the FBI, it'll disappear into a warehouse somewhere and you'll disappear too. Maybe not physically, but they'll destroy your credibility, bury you in legal bills, make you wish you'd never opened that cabin door. What should I do? Brennan pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He found a number and showed it to Jack without calling it. Diana Frost. She's the real deal. Been chasing Resolve under all their different names for 20 years. She's careful, she's smart, and she's the only journalist I know who can't be bought or scared off. You give her this evidence, she'll know what to do with it. She'll protect it and protect you while she builds the story. And when she's ready, she'll publish it in a way that makes it impossible to bury. He put his phone away. But Jack, you need to understand something. Once you do this, there's no taking it back. These people don't forgive and they don't forget. They've had 70 years to get comfortable with their crimes. You're about to make them very uncomfortable. And uncomfortable billionaires are dangerous. Jack thought about his grandfather writing that last journal entry, about choosing exile over watching his sons die, about living alone in those mountains for God knew how long, holding on to truth like it was the only thing worth keeping. He said, I'm a Marine. I've been uncomfortable before. Brennan almost smiled. He wrote something on a napkin and slid it across the table. An address in Missoula. That's where Diana lives. Don't call first. Don't email. Just show up. Tell her I sent you. And Jack? He stood up, threw a 20 on the table for the coffee neither of them had drunk. Be careful. Your grandfather knew they were watching. That's why he disappeared. They're still watching. And now they know you exist. Jack watched the sheriff walk out of the diner and drive away. Then he sat there for another 10 minutes, drinking coffee that had gone cold, looking at the address on the napkin. He thought about Jennifer, about the house he didn't live in anymore, about the comfortable life he could go back to if he just threw the journal away and pretended he'd never found it. But he'd never been good at pretending. He paid his bill and walked out into the Montana morning, where the sky was impossibly blue and the mountains looked close enough to touch. He got in his truck, entered the address into his GPS, and started driving toward a woman he'd never met who might be the only person in the world who could help him finish what his grandfather started. The drive to Missoula took 3 hours. Jack used the time to think, to plan, to run through scenarios the way he'd been trained to do before every mission. He stopped once for gas, paying cash like Brennan had told him to, stopped again at a sporting goods store, and bought a prepaid phone, also with cash. He activated it in the parking lot and saved exactly 2 numbers in it, Brennan's and the one he'd found online for Diana Frost. The address led him to a neighborhood on the north side of Missoula, older houses with big yards and trees that had been growing since before Montana was a state. Diana Frost's house was a small craftsman bungalow painted blue with white trim. There were security cameras on the corners, subtle but visible if you knew what to look for. The windows had bars that tried to look decorative but weren't. This was a house that belonged to someone who understood that privacy was something you had to defend. Jack parked on the street and sat in his truck for a moment, watching. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere. A sprinkler rotated in a front yard across the street. Everything looked normal, but Jack had learned in Iraq that normal was often just good camouflage. He got out, taking only the journal and a folder with the most important documents. He left the core samples and the rest of the evidence locked in a toolbox in the truck bed. If this went wrong, he didn't want to hand everything over at once. He walked up the front path and knocked on the door. Somewhere inside, a dog barked, big and deep. He waited. He could feel the cameras watching him. After about 30 seconds, he heard locks turning. 3 of them. The door opened 6 inches, stopped by a chain. The woman who looked out at him had gray hair cut short and sharp. A face that might have been pretty once, but had decided somewhere along the way that pretty wasn't as useful as tough. Her eyes were the color of steel and just as hard. She said, "I don't buy what you're selling." Jack said, "Sheriff Brennan sent me. My name is Jack Hartley. My grandfather was Samuel Hartley, and I need your help." The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. She studied him for a long moment, then closed the door. He heard the chain sliding free. When the door opened again, it opened all the way. Diana Frost said, "You better come in." The interior of the house was exactly what Jack expected. Books everywhere, filing cabinets that looked military surplus, a desk covered in papers and photographs and maps with pins stuck in them. The dog was a German shepherd, old and gray around the muzzle, who sniffed Jack once and then settled down by the fireplace like he'd decided Jack wasn't worth the energy. Diana gestured to a chair. Jack sat. She didn't offer him coffee or make small talk. She just crossed her arms and said, "Brennan called me 20 minutes ago. Told me you were coming. Told me you found something in your grandfather's cabin. So show me." Jack opened the journal and handed it to her. She took it the way Brennan had, carefully, like it might break. She read standing up, flipping through pages, her eyes moving fast. When she got to the last entry, she stopped. She read it twice. Then she closed the journal and set it on her desk. She said, "Holy shit." Jack waited. She sat down in her desk chair and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Part excitement, part fear, part something that looked almost like relief. She said, "I've been chasing Resolve for 20 years. Started as a reporter for the Missoulian, moved to freelance when the paper wouldn't publish what I was finding. I've tracked them through 6 name changes, 12 shell companies, and enough buried crimes to fill a federal prison. I've interviewed widows and cancer survivors and people whose water wells started glowing in the dark. I've had my tires slashed, my house broken into, my sources threatened. And in 20 years, I've never had hard evidence. Nothing that would stand up in court. Nothing that couldn't be explained away or discredited or lost in legal warfare." She pointed at the journal. "That is hard evidence. That is a first-hand account from an engineer who worked for them, who saw what they were doing and documented it. If even half of what he wrote is true, if the cache he mentioned still exists, this could bring them down. All of them. The company, the board, everyone who's been covering for them for 70 years. Jack said, "So you'll help me?" Diana looked at him like he'd asked if water was wet. "Help you?" "Jack, I've been waiting for someone like you my entire career. Someone with evidence and the guts to use it. The question isn't whether I'll help you. The question is whether you understand what you're signing up for." She leaned forward. "These people are not going to roll over. They're going to come at you with everything they have. Lawyers, private investigators, maybe worse. They're going to dig through your life looking for anything they can use to discredit you. Failed marriage? They'll use it. Say you're unstable. They'll look at your military record, find every mistake you ever made, blow it up in the media. They'll make you wish you'd never heard the name Resolve Mining. Jack thought about the black Suburban at the cabin, about the men in suits who moved like soldiers, about his uncle dying in a hospital bed, finally telling the truth when he had nothing left to lose. He said, "I'm a Marine. We don't quit when things get hard. We dig in." Diana smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who'd found a weapon she'd been looking for. She said, "Then let's go to war." They spent the next 4 hours going through everything Jack had brought. Diana photographed every page of the journal with a high-resolution camera. She scanned the maps and the memos. She made copies and then made copies of the copies. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who understood that evidence was only as good as your ability to protect it. While she worked, she talked. Told Jack things about Resolve that weren't in any public record. How they'd pivoted from mining to defense contracting in the 1960s. How they'd built underground facilities for the government that didn't officially exist. How they'd gotten so intertwined with national security that prosecuting them became impossible. "But," she said, uploading files to an encrypted server, "things have changed. We've got new laws, whistleblower protections, FOIA requests that are harder to stonewall, social media that makes it impossible to bury a story the way they used to. If we do this right, if we build an airtight case, we can force the DOJ to act." Jack said, "What about the cash, the one my grandfather mentioned, the physical evidence?" Diana stopped typing and looked at him. "That's the key. Everything in this journal is powerful, but it's 70 years old. If we can prove they're still doing it, still mining illegally, still dumping waste, we can tie the past to the present, make it a current crime instead of historical wrongdoing. We need to find that cash." Jack nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. Diana pulled up a satellite image on her computer. She zoomed in on the Bitterroot Range, following the trail Jack had hiked. The resolution was good enough to see individual trees. She said, "I've been tracking Resolve's current operations for 5 years. They work through subsidiaries now, different names, different corporate structures, but the same people at the top. And I've found activity here." She pointed to a location about 2 miles from where Samuel's cabin sat. Unusual truck traffic, equipment moving in and out, ground disturbance that shows up on satellite. They're mining something, and they're doing it on federal land without permits. Jack leaned in, studying the screen. "Can we get close enough to document it?" Diana looked at him. "We can try, but it's dangerous. They've got security, cameras probably, maybe armed guards. This isn't some mom-and-pop operation we're talking about. This is a multi-billion-dollar company protecting its interests." Jack said, "I've been in worse places." Diana studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "Okay, but we don't go alone. I know someone, a geologist who used to work for one of Resolve's subsidiaries. He got out because he couldn't stomach what they were doing. He's been sitting on the information for years, too scared to come forward. But if we can show him we're serious, that we have a real shot at taking them down, he might help us." "What's his name?" "Marcus Vance. He's about 60, lives off the grid outside of Lolo. Brilliant guy, knows more about mineral deposits and mining operations than anyone I've ever met. And he hates Resolve with every fiber of his being." Diana picked up her phone and dialed a number. It rang 6 times before someone answered. Jack could hear the voice on the other end, rough and suspicious. Diana said, "Marcus, it's Diana Frost. I need to see you, today. I've got someone you need to meet." She listened for a moment. Then she said, "His name is Jack Hartley. His grandfather was Samuel Hartley. And he's got evidence that's going to burn them down." There was a longer pause. Then Diana smiled. She hung up and looked at Jack. "He'll meet us, tonight, at his place. He said if you're really Samuel Hartley's grandson, he's been waiting to meet you for a long time." The sun was setting when they left Diana's house. Jack followed her Ford Explorer in his truck, driving north out of Missoula into country that got wilder with every mile. The road turned to gravel, then dirt, then became something that was barely a road at all. They passed a sign that said Ilolo National Forest, and then they didn't pass any more signs. Just trees and shadows and the kind of darkness that came when you got far enough from civilization that the stars weren't competing with streetlights. Marcus Vance's place was a cabin that made Samuels look modern. It sat in a clearing surrounded by what looked like 70 years of collected junk. Old mining equipment, rusted trucks, stacks of lumber going gray with age. But the cabin itself was solid, smoke rising from a chimney, lights burning in the windows. The door opened before they could knock. The man who stood there was tall and thin, with white hair pulled back in a ponytail and hands that shook slightly. Parkinson's, Jack guessed. Early stages. Marcus looked at Jack for a long time. Then he said, "You've got his face. Samuel's face. I only met him once, but I remember those eyes." He stepped aside and let them in. The interior of the cabin was chaotic in a way that suggested genius more than madness. Papers covered every surface, books stacked floor to ceiling, topographic maps taped to the walls with routes marked in colored pencil, a computer that looked 20 years old but was clearly still functional, and rocks everywhere. Core samples and mineral specimens and chunks of ore arranged on shelves like a library. Marcus poured coffee that was thick enough to stand a spoon in, and they sat around a table that was covered in geological surveys. He said, "Tell me what you found." Jack told him everything. The cabin, the journal, the cache that Samuel had mentioned. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Jack finished, Marcus stood up and walked to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder so old it was held together with rubber bands. Inside were photographs, mining operations, tailings ponds, men in hazmat suits, and at the bottom, a document marked confidential in red letters. Marcus said, "I worked it for Resolve from 1985 to 2003. 18 years. Started as a field geologist, worked my way up to senior engineer. I saw things that would make you sick. Radioactive waste dumped in unmarked pits, contaminated water pumped into aquifers, workers who got cancer and got fired before they could file for disability. I documented all of it, kept copies of everything, because I knew someday someone would need it." He looked at Jack. "Your grandfather was right about everything. The uranium, the illegal mining, the cover-up. They've been doing it for 70 years, and they're still doing it now. Right now. Same mountains, different technology, same crimes." Diana said, "Can you prove it?" Marcus opened his laptop and turned it so they could see the screen. It showed satellite imagery, time-stamped and dated. He said, "This is from 3 weeks ago, active mining operation, about 2 miles from Samuel's cabin. They're using a shell company called Bitterroot Resources. But the board of directors is the same people who run Resolve. Same crime, different paperwork." Jack studied the images. He could see the scars in the earth, the roads cut through forests, the equipment that looked small from orbit but would be massive up close. He said, "We need to get physical evidence. Photos, samples, something current that ties them to the location." Marcus nodded. "I can guide you. I know the terrain. I know their operation layout. I can tell you where they're most vulnerable, where their security is weakest. But I can't climb anymore." He held up his shaking hands. "This won't let me." Jack said, "You guide, I'll climb." Diana looked at both of them. "And I'll document everything. Cameras, audio, the works. We do this right, we'll have enough evidence to force a federal investigation they can't shut down." Marcus poured more coffee. His hands were steadier now, like having a mission had given them purpose. He said, "There's something else you should know. Your grandfather didn't die in those mountains. At least not the way people think." Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. "What do you mean?" Marcus pulled out another photograph. It showed a grave marker, simple and weathered, in what looked like a small cemetery. "I found this in 2010, was doing survey work in the backcountry, and came across an old mining camp cemetery. Most of the graves were from the 18s, but there was one that wasn't, dated 1967. No name on the marker, just initials. SH. The room went very quiet. Marcus said, "I think your grandfather lived in that cabin for 13 years after he disappeared. I think he survived out there, alone, waiting for someone to find the evidence he'd hidden. And when no one came, when he realized his sons had believed the lie, he died alone with the truth he couldn't tell." Jack felt something break inside him. Not violently, quietly, like ice cracking on a pond. 13 years. His grandfather had lived 13 years in exile, while Jack's father grew up hating him, while Marcus grew up forgetting him, while the world moved on and called him a coward. Diana put her hand on Jack's shoulder. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Jack looked at the satellite images. At the place where his grandfather had hidden evidence, that could have saved him if he'd been brave enough to use it differently. If the world had been different. If justice had mattered more than power. He said, "We're going in tomorrow night. All of us. Diana documents. Marcus guides. I collect samples. We get everything we need to prove they're still doing it. And then we burn them down so hard they can't rise from the ashes." Marcus smiled. It was a terrible smile, full of years of waiting. He said, "Your grandfather would be proud." But Jack wasn't thinking about pride. He was thinking about a man who'd spent 13 years alone in the wilderness, holding on to truth like it was salvation, who died unmarked and unmourned because he'd chosen his children's safety over his own name. That debt was 70 years old, and Jack Hartley was about to start paying it back. They left Marcus's cabin at 4 in the morning when the darkness was at its deepest and the world felt like it belonged to ghosts. Jack drove his truck with Diana following in her Explorer, both vehicles running without headlights until they were far enough from the main road that no one would see them turn off into the forest. The dirt track they followed wasn't on any map. Marcus had drawn it from memory, his shaking hands somehow steady enough to mark every turn, every landmark, every place where the trail would try to disappear. Jack had slept for 3 hours on Marcus's couch, the kind of sleep that came from years of training your body to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself. Diana hadn't slept at all. He could see it in her eyes when they loaded gear into the vehicles, that bright, wired alertness that came from too much coffee and too much adrenaline, and the knowledge that you were about to do something that could get you killed. Marcus had given them everything he had: topographic maps marked with security camera locations, shift schedules for the guards, the layout of the operation based on satellite imagery, and his own professional knowledge of how mining operations worked. He'd handed Jack a Geiger counter, old but functional, the kind geologists used in the field. If there was uranium in those tailings ponds, this would prove it. And if they could prove it, they could prove Resolve was still committing the same crimes Samuel Hartley had died trying to expose. The vehicle stopped 3 miles from the target site. Any closer, and the sound of engines would carry in the mountain silence. Jack and Diana parked in a clearing that looked like it had been used by hunters, pulled branches over the trucks to break up their outline, and checked their gear one final time. Jack wore dark clothes, nothing that would catch light, a tactical vest with pockets for samples and equipment, boots that had carried him through worse terrain than this, the Glock on his hip and a knife strapped to his calf, because going into unknown territory unarmed was a good way to end up dead. Diana had 3 cameras, 2 digital and 1 film, because she said film was harder to dismiss as fake in court. She had audio recorders, a laptop, extra batteries for everything. She'd done this before, Jack realized. Maybe not exactly this, but close enough that she moved with the confidence of someone who knew how to document crimes in places where documenting crimes could get you killed. They moved through the forest like smoke, quiet and deliberate. Jack led because he'd been trained for this. Years of night operations in places where the enemy knew the terrain better than you did, and your survival depended on being quieter than the wind. Diana followed close, stepping where he stepped, breathing when he breathed. Above them, the stars were beginning to fade. Dawn was coming. They had maybe 2 hours before the day shift arrived, and the site went from dangerous to impossible. The first security camera was exactly where Marcus had said it would be, mounted on a tree at the junction of 2 trails. Jack saw the infrared LED glow before he saw the camera itself. He held up a hand and Diana froze. They waited, watching, timing the sweep. The camera rotated on a motor, covering maybe 120 degrees, then pausing before rotating back, 30 seconds each way. Jack counted 3 full cycles to be sure, then moved during the pause, staying low using the terrain. Diana followed. They were past it before the camera swept back to where they'd been. The second camera was harder. It covered an open stretch of trail where there was no cover, just bare rock and scrub brush. Jack studied it for 5 minutes, looking for a blind spot, and finally found one. A depression in the ground, just deep enough that if you crawled on your belly like a snake, the camera's angle wouldn't catch you. He went first, tasting dirt and pine needles, feeling rocks dig into his ribs. Behind him, Diana followed without complaint. When they were clear, she looked at him with something that might have been respect. The mining operation revealed itself slowly, piece by piece as they got closer. First the sound, a low mechanical rumble that you felt in your chest before you heard it. Then the smell, diesel and dust, and something chemical that made the back of Jack's throat burn. Then the lights, harsh and white, turning night into day across maybe 10 acres of torn earth. They stopped at the tree line and Jack pulled out binoculars. What he saw made his jaw tighten. It was a full-scale operation. Excavators, dump trucks, a crusher that was processing ore around the clock, conveyor belts feeding material into buildings that were probably processing facilities. And beyond all of that, a tailings pond that stretched maybe 50 yards across. The water in it, the color of things that should never be in water. Diana was photographing everything with a telephoto lens, the camera shutter making tiny clicks that seemed too loud in the darkness. Jack scanned for guards and found them. Two men on the perimeter, walking patterns that suggested military training. They carried rifles, not hunting rifles, AR-15 style platforms with tactical lights and optics. This wasn't security, this was defense. Jack pulled out the radio Marcus had given them. It was tuned to the frequency Marcus said the operation used. He pressed it to his ear and listened. Static, then voices, clear and professional. Perimeter check north sector, all clear. Copy. South sector clear, next check in 20. So they had 20 minutes before the next patrol cycle. Jack looked at Diana and held up 2 fingers, then pointed at his watch. She nodded. 20 minutes to get in, get what they needed, and get out. They moved along the tree line, staying in shadow, until they found what Marcus had told them to look for. A drainage culvert, old and half-collapsed, that ran from the tailings pond down the slope. It was maybe 3 feet in diameter, barely big enough to crawl through, and it smelled like every toxic thing that had ever been dumped into that pond. But it would get them past the fence line without being seen. Jack went first because that's what leaders did. The culvert was worse than he'd imagined. The water that trickled through it was thick and oily and the wrong color, and the walls were slick with something that might have been algae or might have been chemical residue. He crawled on his elbows and knees, pulling himself through darkness so complete he couldn't see his hand in front of his face, trusting that the other end would open up and not just collapse on top of him. Behind him, he could hear Diana breathing hard, fighting not to panic in the enclosed space. The culvert seemed to go on forever. His shoulders scraped the sides. His head bumped the top. Water soaked through his clothes, cold and wrong against his skin. And then, finally, he saw light ahead. Not much, just the reflection of the operation lights on water. The culvert opened into a ditch at the edge of the tailings pond. Jack emerged into air that tasted like metal and pulled Diana out after him. They lay in the ditch for a moment, both of them breathing hard, covered in filth that would probably give them cancer if they weren't careful. Diana looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Fear. Real fear. Not of getting caught, but of what they were lying in, what it meant, what it proved. She whispered, "This is poison. All of it. Flowing right into the watershed." Jack pulled out the Geiger counter and turned it on. The needle jumped immediately, climbing into the yellow zone, flirting with red. He swept it over the water, over the ground, over the rocks at the edge of the pond. Everywhere he pointed it, the reading was the same. Radioactive. Not Chernobyl levels, but enough. More than enough. Diana was photographing the Geiger counter, the readings, the pond, everything. Her hands were shaking, but the camera was steady. Jack pulled out sample bottles, the kind Marcus had given them, and filled them with water from the pond, sealed them, labeled them with a marker, evidence that would stand up in any court in the country if they could get it there. That's when they heard the voices. 2 men coming around the edge of the processing building. Jack grabbed Diana and pulled her down flat in the ditch. The men walked past not 20 feet away, flashlights swinging. They were talking about a football game, about someone's wife, about normal things that normal people talked about while they walked perimeter around a toxic waste site that was slowly killing the land around it. The men passed. Jack waited until their voices faded before he moved again. He looked at Diana and pointed toward the processing building. She shook her head. Too risky. But Jack wasn't asking for permission. He needed to see inside that building. Needed to know what they were processing. Because if it was uranium, if he could prove it, this went from environmental crime to something the federal government couldn't ignore. He moved low and fast across open ground, using shadows and equipment for cover. The building had windows, small and high, but enough. Jack found a piece of equipment to stand on and looked inside. What he saw made everything his grandfather had written in that journal real, in a way that words on paper could never be. The processing facility was full of equipment that was designed for one thing: extracting uranium from ore. He recognized it from the technical manuals he'd seen in the cabin, from the descriptions Samuel had written. This wasn't a silver mine. It had never been a silver mine. It was uranium extraction happening right now on federal land, without permits, without oversight, without any of the safety protocols that were supposed to protect workers and environment. And it was being run by people who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly why it was illegal. Jack took photographs with Diana's backup camera, shot after shot, documenting everything: the equipment, the warning labels, the barrels marked with radiation symbols, evidence that couldn't be explained away. He was so focused on photographing that he almost missed the sound behind him. Almost, but 20 years in the Marines had given him instincts that operated below the level of conscious thought. He turned, dropping from the equipment, and saw the guard standing 10 feet away with his rifle coming up. The guard said, "Don't move." Jack's hand was already moving toward the Glock, but the guard was young and trained, and his rifle was already pointed center mass. Jack froze. The smart play. The only play. The guard keyed his radio with his free hand. "This is Sector 4. I have an intruder at Processing Building 3, requesting backup." The radio crackled. "Copy Sector 4. Backup en route. Detain him." The guard gestured with the rifle. "On the ground. Face down. Hands behind your head." Jack calculated angles and distances and odds. The guard was maybe 25, probably ex-military from the way he held the weapon. The rifle was an AR-15 with a red dot sight. At this range, if the guard decided to shoot, Jack would be dead before he cleared his holster. But if he went down on the ground, hands behind his head, Diana would be on her own, and whatever happened next would happen without him being able to do anything about it. He made a choice. He said, "Look, man, I'm just a hiker who got lost." The guard's eyes narrowed. "Bullshit. You're covered in tailings. You've got cameras, and you're on restricted property." "So I'll say it again, on the ground." Jack heard voices in the distance, more guards coming, maybe a minute away, maybe less. He went down on the ground, put his hands behind his head, felt the guard's boot on his back pinning him, felt the rifle barrel against the base of his skull, cold and impersonal and absolute. The guard said, "You picked the wrong place to go hiking." Jack closed his eyes and thought about his grandfather spending 13 years alone in these mountains, about dying unmarked and unmourned, about evidence that could have saved him if the world had been different. And then he heard the voice from the shadows, calm and clear and very, very angry. Diana said, "He's not alone." The guard's head turned. Jack felt the rifle barrel shift just slightly as the guard tried to cover two threats at once. Diana stepped into the light with her camera held up like a weapon, and she said the words that Jack knew would either save them or get them both killed. She said, "Everything that just happened is on video, with audio, and it's already uploading to 3 different servers. So you can shoot us, but all that does is add murder to the list of crimes we're documenting. Your choice." It was a bluff. The cameras didn't have that capability, but the guard didn't know that. Jack could feel the hesitation through the boot on his back, could feel the guard running the calculation, could feel the moment when training ran into something training didn't cover. The radio on the guard's belt squawked. "Backup arriving Sector 4. Do you have the situation contained?" The guard's finger was on the trigger. Jack could see it from the corner of his eye, could see the young man's face trying to decide what contained meant when the intruder's partner was standing there with a camera and a story that would make the evening news. Then another voice cut through the night, older, more authoritative. "Stand down, Miller." The rifle barrel lifted from Jack's skull. The boot came off his back. Jack turned his head carefully and saw a man in his 50s walking toward them, not wearing tactical gear, but a suit that looked out of place in a mining operation at 5 in the morning. Behind him, 3 more guards, all armed, all watching Jack and Diana with the kind of attention that said they were professionals. The man in the suit looked at Jack, looked at Diana, looked at the cameras and the Geiger counter and the sample bottles that were clearly visible. He said, "My name is Vincent Cross, and I think we need to have a conversation." Jack got to his feet slowly, hands visible, making no sudden moves. Vincent Cross. He knew that name. Diana had mentioned it. CEO of Resolve Mining, or whatever they were calling themselves this week. Grandson of the man who'd founded the company. The man who'd probably given the orders that forced Samuel Hartley into exile. Cross gestured to the guards. "Lower your weapons. Nobody's shooting anyone today." The guards obeyed, but they didn't relax. Cross turned to Diana. He said, Miss Frost, I've been reading your work for years. Very thorough, very persistent, and mostly very wrong. Diana said nothing, but her camera was still recording. Cross turned to Jack. And you must be Jack Hartley, Samuel's grandson. You have his eyes. I've seen photographs. Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. How do you know who I am? Cross smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Mr. Hartley, the moment you opened that cabin door, I knew. We've had monitoring equipment in that area for 30 years. Motion sensors, cameras. Your Uncle Marcus disabled some of them when he visited in 2010, but not all. We've known about the cabin, about the journal, about everything your grandfather left behind. We've just been waiting to see if anyone would ever be foolish enough to use it. Diana said, so you admit the journal is real? That everything Samuel Hartley documented is true? Cross looked at her. I admit that Samuel Hartley was a brilliant engineer who misunderstood a complex situation, that he made accusations based on partial information, that he let paranoia turn professional disagreement into something tragic. Jack's hands curled into fists. He forced them open, forced himself to stay calm. You killed him. Cross shook his head. No, Mr. Hartley, we didn't kill your grandfather. He killed himself. He chose to walk away from his family and live in isolation rather than accept that sometimes progress requires difficult choices. The uranium mining in the 1940s and 50s was authorized at the highest levels of government. Was it done perfectly? No. Did mistakes happen? Yes, but it was necessary. National security required it. The Cold War required it. That's what you're going with, Jack said, national security? You poisoned an entire watershed. You gave cancer to God knows how many people. You've been running an illegal operation for 70 years, and you're calling it national security? Cross's expression didn't change. I'm calling it complicated, Mr. Hartley. Something you'll understand when you're older. When you've had to make decisions where all the options are bad and you choose the one that does the least harm. Diana said, we have samples, we have radiation readings, we have photographs. This isn't complicated, this is criminal. Cross looked at her with something that might have been pity. Ms. Frost, you have samples from a location you accessed illegally through trespassing. You have photographs taken during the commission of a felony, and you have no chain of custody, no independent verification, nothing that would be admissible in any court. What you have is a very good way to get yourselves arrested and discredited. He pulled out his phone and made a call. 30 seconds later, Jack heard sirens in the distance, getting closer. Cross said, I've called the county sheriff. Not Sheriff Brennan, unfortunately. He recused himself from anything involving your family, which was very professional of him. But his deputy will be here shortly to arrest you for trespassing, vandalism, and attempted theft of corporate property. You'll spend the night in jail. A judge who understands the complexity of these situations will set bail very high. And by the time you get out, if you get out, your evidence will have been properly cataloged and lost in the criminal justice system. Jack looked at Diana, saw his own realization reflected in her eyes. They'd been set up. From the moment they entered the property, maybe from the moment Jack opened that cabin door, they'd been walking into a trap. Cross said, or we can handle this differently. The sirens were very close now, maybe a minute away. Cross looked at Jack with eyes that were tired and old despite the man's relatively young face. You're a veteran, Mr. Hartley. You understand difficult decisions. I'm prepared to offer you $10 million. Cash. Offshore account. You walk away from this. Destroy the journal. Forget you ever heard the name Resolve Mining. Live your life. Your son, Daniel, I understand he's a journalist. I can make sure he gets opportunities. Real opportunities. The kind that lead to Pulitzers and book deals. Jack said, you've been researching me. Cross said, I've been researching your family since 1954. I know everything about you, Jack. Your divorce, your failing business, the estrangement from your son. I know what you've lost, and I know what it would take to make you whole again. He paused. Or you can go to jail, fight this in court for years, spend every penny you have on lawyers. Watch your reputation get destroyed in the media. Watch your son's career get blacklisted before it starts. And in the end, you'll lose. Because we've been doing this for 70 years and we've never lost. Not once. The siren stopped. Jack heard car doors slamming, voices, boots on gravel. Cross said, "You have about 30 seconds to decide. Take the money or take your chance with the system." Diana was looking at Jack, not with judgment, just waiting to see what kind of man he was, what he was made of when it came down to the moment where everything hung in the balance. Jack thought about his grandfather, about 13 years alone in the mountains, about dying with the truth locked in a journal because speaking it would have cost too much. He thought about his father, growing up hating a man who'd loved him enough to disappear. He thought about the grave marker Marcus had found, SH 1967, unmarked and unmourned. And he thought about what it meant to be a Marine, to have a code that you lived by even when living by it cost you everything. He looked at Vincent Cross and said no. Cross's expression didn't change. He'd expected this, maybe even respected it. He said, "Then you're a fool, just like your grandfather." He turned and walked away as deputies came around the corner, flashlights and drawn weapons and voices shouting commands. Jack and Diana put their hands up, got down on their knees, got cuffed with plastic zip ties that cut into their wrists. The deputies searched them, found the cameras, found the samples, found the Geiger counter, bagged it all as evidence. One of the deputies was young, couldn't have been more than 23, and he looked uncomfortable with what was happening. The other was older, harder, and he handled Jack like a piece of meat. They were put in the separate vehicles. Jack in one, Diana in another. As they pulled away from the site, Jack turned in his seat and looked back. Vincent Cross was standing in the light from the processing facility, watching them go. He looked tired, almost sad, like he'd just done something necessary that he didn't enjoy. The holding cell in the county jail was exactly what Jack expected. Concrete and bars and a bench that was designed to be impossible to sleep on. They'd processed him like he was a common criminal. Fingerprints, mugshot, strip search, everything taken except his clothes. He sat on the bench and waited. Hours passed. No lawyer, no phone call, no information. Just silence and fluorescent lights and the sound of doors slamming somewhere deeper in the facility. It was maybe noon when the guard came and said he had a visitor. They took him to a room with a table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. The guard cuffed his hands to a ring on the table and left him there. When the door opened again, Jack expected a public defender or maybe Diana's lawyer. What he didn't expect was the man who walked in. He was young, maybe 28, dark hair, sharp eyes, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that had seen better days. He carried a notebook and a phone, and he moved with the kind of nervous energy that said he was running on coffee and purpose. He sat down across from Jack and said, "Dad." Jack stared at his son, Daniel, who he hadn't seen in 2 years, who had stopped returning his calls after the divorce, who Jack had thought was lost to him the way so many things were lost. Daniel said, "I saw your name on the arrest report. Trespassing on resolved property. Attempted theft. The bail's set at $200,000. You don't have that kind of money, do you?" Jack shook his head. Couldn't quite find words. Daniel pulled out his phone. "I called Mom. She said you were trying to do something stupid and noble. Said it was the most like yourself you'd been in years. She also said she'd sell the house before she'd let you sit in jail." Jack's throat was tight. "She said that?" Daniel nodded. "But you're not going to need it, because I posted bail an hour ago. You're getting out." "How?" Daniel smiled. It was a hard smile, full of something Jack hadn't seen in his son before. Determination. "I sold a story. Advance payment. Big advance. New York Times Magazine wants 10,000 words on Resolve Mining and the Hartley family. They want the journal. They want the evidence. They want everything." Jack said, "I'm under arrest. The evidence is seized. How are you going to write that story?" Daniel opened his notebook. "Dad, before the cops bagged those cameras, Diana uploaded everything to a cloud server. Every photograph, every video, every radiation reading. I have copies. And I have your grandfather's journal because Diana scanned every page before you ever left Missoula. She's been doing this long enough to know how these things go." He looked at his father. "You were right to say no to Cross. He was counting on you being desperate enough to take the money. But you weren't. You did the hard thing, the right thing, and now I'm going to finish what you started. What Grandpa Samuel started." Jack felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been broken for a long time starting to heal. He said, "You don't have to do this. They'll come after you the same way they came after me." Daniel said, "I'm a journalist, Dad. This is what I do, and I'm really good at it. Plus, I'm pretty sure I inherited the stubborn gene from both sides of the family." The guard came back in. told them their time was up. As they uncuffed Jack, Daniel stood and said, "They're releasing you this afternoon. Diana too. All charges being dropped due to," and I quote, "irregularities in the arrest procedure. My guess is Sheriff Brennan made some calls. Or maybe someone higher up realized this was going to look really bad in the press." They walked out of the interview room together, father and son, for the first time in years, walking the same direction. Daniel said, "I'm going to write the hell out of this story, Dad. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what Samuel Hartley tried to do, what you're trying to do. And when I'm done, there won't be anywhere for Resolve to hide." Jack said, "They're powerful. They have resources we can't imagine." Daniel looked at him with eyes that were young but not naive. "So do we. We have the truth, and the truth is a hell of a weapon when you know how to use it." They stepped out into the Montana afternoon. The sun was bright and the sky was that impossible blue that made everything feel like maybe there was still hope in the world. Diana was waiting on the steps, looking tired but unbroken. She saw Jack and Daniel together and smiled. She said, "I see you found your journalist." Daniel said, "He found me. Or maybe Grandpa Samuel found both of us. Hard to say." Jack stood between them, his son and this woman he barely knew. Both of them willing to fight a battle that most people would have walked away from. Both of them willing to risk everything for a truth that was 70 years old and still mattered. He thought about Samuel's grave marker in that forgotten cemetery, about 13 years of exile, about a man who died holding on to evidence because he believed that someday someone would be brave enough to use it. That day had come, and Jack Hartley, standing in the sun with his son beside him in the fight just beginning, understood what his grandfather had known all along. Some truths don't die. They just wait for the right people at the right time to bring them into the light where lies can't survive. Daniel's apartment in Seattle was small and cluttered with the organized chaos of someone who lived inside their work. Stacks of newspapers, filing boxes labeled with case names Jack didn't recognize, a corkboard covering one entire wall with photographs and articles connected by red string like something out of a crime drama. The couch where Jack slept for the first 3 nights folded out into a bed that was exactly as uncomfortable as it looked. But it was the first place in weeks where Jack felt like he could breathe without looking over his shoulder. Diana had gone back to Missoula to coordinate with Sheriff Brennan and Marcus Vance. She was building a timeline, cross-referencing Samuel's journal entries with historical records, pulling permits and land deeds from county archives that went back to the 1940s. She called every night with updates, her voice tight with the kind of excitement that came from finally seeing pieces fit together after years of trying. Daniel worked 20 hours a day. Jack would wake at 3 in the morning to find his son still at the desk, typing with a fury that made the keyboard sound like machine gun fire. Empty coffee cups formed a small city across every flat surface. When Jack suggested sleep, Daniel would look at him with eyes that were red-rimmed but burning and say he'd sleep when the story was filed. Jack tried to help but quickly realized he was out of his depth. This wasn't a fight he knew how to fight. There were no clear lines, no obvious enemies, no tactical solutions. This was information warfare, and his son was a soldier in a battle Jack barely understood. So instead, Jack made food, kept the coffee coming, made sure Daniel ate something other than takeout. Small things. The things a father could do when his son was fighting a war with words. On the 4th day, Daniel's editor at the New York Times called. Jack heard only one side of the conversation, but it was enough to understand the shape of what was happening. Daniel said, "I have everything. Journal entries, photographs, radiation readings, testimony from a former Resolve geologist, satellite imagery showing active mining on federal land. This isn't speculation. This is documentation." A pause. Daniel's jaw tightened. "No, I'm not worried about libel. Every fact is sourced. Every claim is backed by evidence that will hold up in court. And yes, I know they have lawyers. They also have 70 years of criminal activity that's about to become public record." Another pause, longer. "Then I'll publish it independently. I'll put it online. I'll give it to ProPublica or The Intercept or anyone else who has the spine to run it, because this story is getting told. With or without the Times." Jack saw something in his son in that moment, something he recognized from looking in mirrors after firefights, determination that had hardened past the point where fear could touch it. The editor must have backed down because Daniel's expression softened slightly. He said, 2 weeks. I need 2 weeks for final verification and legal review. But I want a guarantee. Front page, above the fold, Sunday edition. This is the kind of story that changes things. He hung up and looked at Jack. They're running it, October 15th, front page. Jack felt something shift in his chest, relief and dread in equal measure. When is that? 10 days from now. 10 days until the truth Samuel Hartley had died protecting finally saw daylight. 10 days for Resolve to prepare their response. 10 days for Vincent Cross and his lawyers and his connections in Washington to decide how hard they were going to fight back. Jack said, "They're not going to just let this happen." Daniel pulled up a news site on his laptop and turned it so Jack could see. The headline read, "Mining Executive Vincent Cross Announces Retirement for Health Reasons." The article was dated that morning. It quoted Cross saying he'd been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer and would be stepping down from all operational duties to focus on his health and family. It was 3 paragraphs long and buried in the business section where no one would notice it. Daniel said, "He's positioning himself. Sick old man who made mistakes but did his best. When our story drops, he'll play the sympathy card. Say he inherited a mess from his grandfather and tried to fix it, but cancer got in the way. That's pretty calculated for a dying man." Daniel looked at his father. "You think he's actually sick?" Jack thought about the way Cross had looked that night at the mining site. Tired, old beyond his years, like a man carrying weight he wanted to put down. He said, "Yeah, I think he is, but I also think he's smart enough to use it." Over the next week, Jack watched his son work with an intensity that was almost frightening. Daniel interviewed people over encrypted video calls, former Resolve employees who'd signed NDAs but were willing to talk off the record, environmental scientists who'd been tracking contamination in the Bitterroot watershed for decades, a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower cases and explained in careful legal language how everything Samuel had documented was still prosecutable under current law. Diana sent files, Marcus sent analysis. Sheriff Brennan sent court records from the 1950s that showed how complaints against Resolve had been systematically dismissed. It all went into Daniel's article, which was growing into something that read less like journalism and more like an indictment. On the 8th day, Diana called with news that made Jack's blood run cold. She said, "Marcus is in the hospital. Someone broke into his cabin last night, beat him pretty badly. He's conscious, but they fractured his skull. Sheriff says it looks like a robbery gone wrong, but nothing was taken." Jack's hands tightened on the phone. "Where is he?" "St. Patrick in Missoula, ICU. They're saying he'll recover, but it'll take time." Jack said, "This wasn't random." "No," Diana said, "it wasn't. This was a message. They're telling us they can reach anyone, that nobody's safe." Jack looked at Daniel, who'd stopped typing and was listening. "Are you safe?" Jack asked. Diana's laugh was bitter. "I've had a security system since 2015. Cameras, alarms, and I've been sleeping with a shotgun next to my bed for longer than that. I'm as safe as anyone can be when they're making powerful people nervous." After they hung up, Daniel said, "We need to move the timeline up. If they're willing to hurt Marcus, they're escalating. We can't wait until the 15th. Can the Times run it earlier?" Daniel was already typing, sending emails. "We're about to find out." The answer came back in 2 hours. The legal team needed 3 more days to verify sources and prepare for the inevitable lawsuit. October 12th was the earliest they could publish. That was 5 days away. Daniel said, "Then we go with 12, and we prepare for whatever comes next." Jack said, "What comes next is they try to destroy your credibility. They'll dig into your past, find anything they can use." Daniel met his father's eyes. "Then they won't find much. I've been broke my whole career. No assets to threaten, no scandals to expose. The worst thing they'll find is a DUI from college and some student loans I'm still paying off." "What about Jennifer?" Jack asked. "Your mother, will they go after her?" Daniel's expression hardened. "Mom knows. I called her. She said, and I quote, 'If those bastards come anywhere near me, I'll give them an interview that'll make their lawyers cry.'" Despite everything, Jack smiled. That sounded exactly like Jennifer. Fierce when it mattered. Protective of their son in ways that transcended divorce. The next 3 days were the longest of Jack's life. Waiting had never been his strength. In the Marines, there was always something to do, gear to check, plans to review. But here in his son's apartment, with the story written and filed and locked in the New York Times editorial system, there was nothing to do but wait for the clock to run out. He called the hospital daily to check on Marcus. The old geologist was recovering, but slowly. The doctors said he'd been hit with something heavy and methodical. Professional work disguised as random violence. Marcus couldn't remember much. Just a sound behind him, then pain, then waking up with deputies standing over him asking questions he couldn't answer. Diana hired private security. Not much, just a former cop who sat in a car outside her house at night. But it was something. Sheriff Brennan increased patrols in the area and made it very clear to anyone who'd listen that he was watching Resolve's people very carefully. On October 11th, the day before publication, Daniel got a call from a number that wasn't in his contacts. He put it on speaker. The voice on the other end was familiar. Vincent Cross. He said, "Mr. Hartley?" "Daniel, may I call you Daniel?" Daniel said, "You can call me whatever you want. Doesn't change what we're publishing tomorrow." Cross's voice sounded tired, more tired than Jack remembered from the mining site. "I'm calling to ask you not to publish, not as a threat, as a request, from one man to another." Daniel said, "Why would I do that?" "Because publication destroys more than just my company. It destroys the people who work for us. 1,500 employees across 4 states, good people with families and mortgages. If Resolve collapses, they lose everything. The towns where we operate, they depend on our tax revenue. Schools, hospitals, infrastructure. You're not just taking down a corporation, Daniel, you're taking down communities." Jack watched his son's face, saw him processing the argument, saw him considering it with the same careful attention he gave every source and every fact. Daniel said, "Those communities are being poisoned. Their water is contaminated. Their cancer rates are 3 times the national average. You want to talk about destroying lives? You've been doing that for 70 years. Cross said, "We're prepared to make changes, real changes. I've already resigned. The board is bringing in new leadership, environmental consultants, EPA oversight. We'll clean up the sites. We'll compensate the affected families. But if you publish tomorrow, the lawsuits will force us into bankruptcy before we can make any of that happen. The truth is, Daniel, your story might feel righteous, but the outcome is chaos that hurts the very people you think you're helping." It was a good argument, smart, appealing to conscience instead of fear. Jack could see why Vincent Cross had run a company for 30 years. The man understood leverage. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Cross, my grandfather was Samuel Hartley. He tried to do the right thing in 1953, and you people made him disappear into the mountains for 13 years. He died alone because telling the truth was too dangerous. I'm not making that choice. The story runs tomorrow. What happens after that is on you, not me." Cross sighed. It sounded genuine. It sounded like a man who'd tried his last play and knew it had failed. He said, "Then I hope you're prepared for what comes next. Because I've been doing this long enough to know that truth is a weapon that cuts both ways. You're about to learn that the hard way." The line went dead. Daniel looked at his father. "You think he meant that as a threat?" Jack thought about the man he'd met at the mining site, about the offer of $10 million, about the way Cross had looked when Jack said no. He said, "I think he meant it as a warning. There's a difference." That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay on the fold-out couch listening to the city sounds outside. Seattle was quieter than he'd expected, or maybe he was just used to the silence of Montana mountains. He thought about his grandfather, about those 13 years alone, about the choice Samuel had made to protect his family by destroying his own life. Jack had made a different choice. He'd said no to the money, no to the easy way out, and now his son was about to publish a story that would make them both targets, but they'd be targets together, fighting together, the way Samuel had fought alone. Around 3 in the morning, Jack got up and found Daniel still at his desk, not working anymore, just staring at the screen. Jack said, "You okay?" Daniel didn't look away from the screen. "I keep thinking about what Cross said, about the people who'll lose their jobs, the communities that'll suffer. What if he's right? What if I'm about to cause more harm than good?" Jack pulled up a chair and sat next to his son. He remembered having these same doubts before every mission that mattered. The weight of knowing your choices would have consequences you couldn't predict or control. He said, "Your grandfather wrote something in his journal. I remember it because it felt true in a way that most things don't. He said the only thing worse than the pain of doing the right thing is the regret of not doing it. Those people who might lose their jobs, they're already being hurt by poison in their water, by cancer clusters that Resolve knew about and hid. You're not creating harm, Daniel. You're exposing it. And yeah, that's going to be painful, but pain that leads to healing is different than pain that just continues because nobody has the courage to name it. Daniel finally looked at him. When did you get wise? Jack smiled. About 5 minutes ago. Don't expect it to last. October 12th arrived with gray skies and rain that looked like it might never stop. Jack woke early, made coffee, and watched his son sleep for the first time in what felt like weeks. Daniel looked young in sleep, vulnerable, like the boy who'd grown up asking his father to teach him how to throw a baseball and fix a crane and be the kind of man worth becoming. Jack had tried to teach those things, had tried and failed in ways he was still understanding. But maybe he'd taught something more important without meaning to. Maybe he'd taught his son that some things were worth fighting for even when the fight cost everything. The New York Times published at 6 a.m. Eastern, 3 a.m. Pacific. Jack was awake when his phone started buzzing with news alerts. He opened the Times app, and there it was. Front page, above the fold, just like Daniel had demanded. The headline read, "Decades of Deception. How a mining giant poisoned Montana and silenced the whistleblower who tried to stop them." The byline was Daniel Hartley. Jack read the article standing in the kitchen while rain drummed against the windows. It was everything Daniel had promised it would be. Thorough, devastating, impossible to dismiss. It started with Samuel's story, the young engineer returning from war, the job with resolve, the discovery of illegal uranium mining, the threats, the choice to disappear rather than watch his family die. Then it moved to the present, the continued mining, the contamination, the cancer clusters, the cover-up that spans 70 years in multiple administrations. Daniel had names, dates, documents, photographs of the tailings pond glowing under black light, testimony from Marcus Vance and 3 other former employees who'd finally agreed to go on record. And woven through it all was Jack's story, the cabin, the journal, the grave marker dated 1967, the grandson who'd finished what his grandfather started. By the time Jack finished reading, his hands were shaking, not from fear, from something else. Pride maybe, or relief, or the simple knowledge that it was done. The truth was out, and whatever came next, they'd face it in daylight instead of shadow. Daniel woke to his phone ringing nonstop. Calls from other journalists, from lawyers, from environmental groups, from the EPA regional office saying they were opening an immediate investigation, from a senator's aide asking if Daniel would be willing to testify before Congress. Diana called crying. Jack had never heard her cry before. She said, "We did it. Samuel, we finally did it." Marcus called from the hospital. His voice was slurred from painkillers, but clear enough. He said, "I'm watching it on the news. They're talking about us, about Samuel, about all of it. This is what I've been waiting for. This is why I lived long enough." Sheriff Brennan called to say the FBI had contacted him. They were sending agents to Montana to begin a formal investigation. He also said Jack should probably get a lawyer because there was going to be fallout and it was going to get complicated. By noon, every major news network was running the story. Jack watched CNN interview an environmental scientist who broke down the contamination data and said this was potentially the largest case of illegal uranium mining in American history. He watched Fox News interview a former EPA administrator who said heads needed to roll all the way up to whatever federal officials had been covering for resolve. He watched MSNBC bring on a legal expert who said the evidence Daniel had published was strong enough to support criminal charges against multiple corporate executives, possibly including Vincent Cross himself. And through it all, Jack kept thinking about his grandfather, about the man in the photograph holding that compass, about 13 years alone in the mountains, holding on to evidence because he believed it mattered, because he believed that someday someone would care enough to use it. That day had come. By the evening, the stock market had reacted. Resolve Mining, which traded under the name Bitterroot Holdings after their 6th corporate restructuring, dropped 40% in a single day. Trading was halted twice for volatility. The board of directors issued a statement saying they were shocked and appalled by the allegations and would be cooperating fully with all investigations. Vincent Cross issued his own statement through his lawyer. It was 2 sentences long. "I take full responsibility for failures and oversight during my tenure. I will be making no further public comments on advice of counsel." Daniel did 3 television interviews that evening. Jack watched from the apartment as his son sat in a Seattle studio and calmly, methodically explained to millions of people why this story mattered, why Samuel Hartley's sacrifice mattered, Why speaking truth to power was never easy but always necessary. In one interview, the host asked, "What would you say to your grandfather if he were here today?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'd say thank you for not giving up. Thank you for believing that someone would come along who'd finish what you started. And I'd say, I'm sorry it took us 70 years." Jack felt tears on his face and didn't bother wiping them away. That night, Diana called with news that was both expected and devastating. She said, "Vincent Cross died an hour ago. Hospice care at his home. They're saying the cancer was more advanced than anyone knew. He had maybe days left anyway." Jack sat down heavily. So he knew. When he called Daniel, when he made that last offer, he knew he was dying. Diana said, "I think he was trying to control his legacy, trying to make one last deal. But in the end, the truth got there first." "Do you feel bad for him?" Jack asked. Diana was quiet for a moment. "I feel bad for the man he could have been if he'd made different choices. But the man he was, the man who continued his grandfather's crimes and covered them up for 30 years? No, I don't feel bad for him." Jack understood. Mercy for the person, justice for the crimes. They weren't mutually exclusive. The FBI arrived in Montana 2 days later. A team of 6 agents who set up a field office in Missoula and started issuing subpoenas like they were going out of style. They interviewed Diana. They interviewed Marcus, still in his hospital bed. They interviewed Sheriff Brennan and pulled decades of files from county records. And they called Jack and asked him to come back to Montana to provide testimony. Jack flew out with Daniel, who'd been invited to observe the federal grand jury proceedings as a member of the press. The flight was short, but it felt eternal. Jack stared out the window at the mountains below and thought about all the times he'd made this journey in the last 2 months. Each time he'd been a different person. Lost, then searching, then fighting, and now something else. A witness. Someone who'd seen history and lived to tell about it. The federal building in Missoula was gray concrete and bulletproof glass. Jack testified for 3 hours, walking the grand jury through everything, finding the cabin, reading the journal, the confrontation with Vincent Cross, the arrest, all of it on the record, under oath, preserved for whatever came next. When he finished, the lead prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, shook his hand. She said, "Mr. Hartley, what you and your son did takes the kind of courage most people never find. Your grandfather would be proud." Jack said, "I hope so." She said, "We're issuing indictments next week. Multiple executives, federal charges, conspiracy, environmental crimes, fraud. This is going to be a long process, but I promise you, justice is coming." Jack believed her. For the first time in a long time, he believed that the system might actually work. That evening, Jack and Daniel drove out to the cabin. They'd called ahead to make sure it was okay, and the FBI had cleared them to visit as long as they didn't disturb anything. The trail was easier now that Jack knew the way. The cabin looked the same as it had that first day, weathered and strong and holding its secrets close. They sat on the porch in the fading light, father and son, looking out at the mountains that had kept Samuel's truth for 70 years. Daniel said, "I want to write a book. Not about resolve, about him, about Grandpa Samuel, about what it meant to make the choice he made, about living with that choice for 13 years. Jack said, "I think he'd like that." They sat in silence as the sun went down and the stars came out, bright and cold and infinite. Somewhere in these mountains, there was a grave marker with initials that most people would never see. But Jack knew where it was now. Marcus had given him the coordinates. Tomorrow, he and Daniel would hike there. They'd bring flowers. They'd bring the compass Samuel had carried through France. And they'd tell him that his story was finally told, that the evidence he'd preserved had done exactly what he'd hoped it would do, that he hadn't died for nothing. Daniel said, "Dad, why do you think he stayed? After he knew Mom, Grandma, Uncle Marcus were safe, why didn't he just come back?" Jack had thought about this, had thought about it every night since reading that journal. He said, "I think he couldn't live with who he'd have to become to come back, to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen, to watch resolve keep operating and stay silent about it. Some men can live with compromise. Your grandfather wasn't one of them, so he stayed, and he waited, and he held on to the truth because it was all he had left that mattered." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's going in the book." They stayed until the cold drove them back to the truck. As they walked down the trail in darkness, using flashlights to find their way, Jack thought about all the people who'd walked this path. His grandfather, alone and determined. His Uncle Marcus, scared but searching. himself lost and looking for purpose. And now Daniel, the next generation, carrying the story forward. The truth Samuel Hartley had protected was finally free. And the men who tried to bury it were learning what Jack's grandfather had always known. Some debts take 70 years to pay, but they get paid, one way or another. They always get paid. The cemetery was older than Montana statehood, tucked into a fold of land where the Bitterroot Range met the valley floor. Most of the markers were from the 18s, weathered granite and marble telling stories and dates that spanned whole lifetimes in just two numbers. Miners who died young, women who died in childbirth, children who died of diseases that didn't exist anymore. The kind of cemetery that reminded you that history wasn't just something you read about. It was bone and stone and the silence of people who'd lived hard and died harder. Jack and Daniel hiked in at dawn, the October air cold enough to burn in the lungs. They carried flowers that seemed ridiculous in this setting, white roses that Jennifer had insisted on when Jack called to tell her where they were going. She'd asked to come, but Jack had said no. This needed to be just him and Daniel. She'd understood. After 25 years of marriage, she still understood the things Jack couldn't quite put into words. Marcus had given them coordinates, but also a description. Northwest corner, under a pine tree that had been there since before the cemetery. A marker with no name, just initials carved into stone that was already weathering away when Marcus found it in 2010. They found it exactly where Marcus said it would be. The stone was simple, maybe 18 inches tall, rough cut, the kind someone had made by hand without professional tools. The carving was shallow and uneven but readable. SH, and below that, 1918, 1967. Jack stood looking at it for a long time, doing math in his head. Samuel Hartley had been born in 1918, had died in 1967, 49 years old, which meant he'd spent 13 years in these mountains after disappearing. 13 years alone, outliving his wife by 3 years, based on the dates Jack knew, dying the same year Daniel was born, though neither of them would have known about the other. Daniel set the flowers down in front of the marker. They looked out of place against the stone and pine needles. Too perfect, too alive. He said, "Do you think anyone else has been here since Marcus found it?" Jack shook his head. Marcus said the cemetery's not on any maps. It's on private land that's been abandoned since the 1970s. Probably not a dozen people know it exists. So he's been alone, even in death. Jack knelt and traced the initials with his finger. The stone was cold, rough. He tried to imagine the person who'd carved it. Probably Samuel himself, knowing his time was coming. Making his own marker because there was no one else to do it. Choosing initials instead of a full name because even at the end, he was protecting something. Protecting the family he'd left behind from being connected to a dead man in an unmarked grave. Jack said, "I don't think he minded being alone. I think by the end, it was all he knew." Daniel had pulled out his phone and was taking photographs. "Not for the book," he said when Jack looked at him. "For us. So we remember." They sat on the ground with their backs against the pine tree, looking at the marker in the mountains beyond. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning fog. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. Jackie said, The grand jury handed down indictments yesterday, 12 executives, including Vincent Cross posthumously. The charges are federal conspiracy, environmental crimes, fraud, obstruction of justice. Diana called last night. She said the prosecutors think they can tie the current operations directly to decisions made in the 1950s, which means they can pierce the corporate veil, go after personal assets, the whole thing. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does it feel like enough, all of this? The indictments, the investigations, the story. Does it feel like justice for what happened to him?" Jack looked at the marker, at the initials that represented a man who'd given up everything to protect a truth that took 70 years to matter. He said, "I don't know if justice is something you feel. I think it's something you know happened, even if it doesn't fix anything. Your grandfather died alone. That doesn't change. But because he died holding on to that evidence, because he believed it mattered enough to preserve, 12 people are going to prison. A company that operated above the law for 70 years is going to collapse. And maybe, just maybe, the people who got sick from the poison they dumped will get compensation. That's not nothing." Daniel nodded slowly. "I start interviews next week. For the book. I want to talk to everyone who knew him. Anyone who's still alive from that time. I want to know what he was like before he had to become the man who disappeared. Who have you found? A few people. There's a woman in Missoula, 93 years old, who went to school with him. She remembers him as quiet but kind, said he helped her with mathematics when she was failing. There's a man in Idaho who served with him in France. He's 97 in a nursing home, but his mind is sharp. He said Samuel was the bravest man in their unit because he'd volunteer for anything that needed doing, even the jobs that got you killed. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. That sounds right. From the journal, from everything Marcus said, he was the kind of man who saw what needed doing and did it. They sat in silence for a while. Jack pulled the compass from his pocket, the brass one he'd found in the cabin. He'd been carrying it since that first day, some superstitious part of him feeling like it was important to keep it close. The initials on the back had worn smooth from handling. SH 1945, Normandy. He set it on the grave marker, balancing it carefully. Daniel said, "You're leaving it here?" Jack nodded. He carried it through a war, then through another war that nobody knew about except him. I think he's earned his rest. They stayed until the sun was fully up and the cold had burned off into something that felt almost like warmth. Before they left, Jack put his hand on the marker one last time. He said, "We finished it. Everything you started, everything you died protecting. It mattered. You mattered." The wind moved through the pine trees, and for just a moment, it sounded like a voice. Or maybe that was just what Jack needed to hear. The trial didn't start until spring, but the fallout was immediate and devastating. Resolve Mining filed for bankruptcy in November. The corporate structure collapsed like a house made of cards, each subsidiary pulling down the next until the whole thing was rubble and lawyers fighting over scraps. 1,500 people lost their jobs, like Vincent Cross had predicted. But most of them found new work because other companies moved in, legitimate operations that followed the law and paid fair wages and didn't poison the water. The cleanup of the Beirut sites took 4 years and cost the federal government $200 million. They dug up tailings ponds and hauled away contaminated soil and restored the land to something close to what it had been before Resolve came along. It would never be pristine. Some scars don't heal, but it was better, measurably, scientifically better. The Victims' Compensation Fund paid out $300 million to families who could prove illness from the contamination. Not everyone got what they deserved, but most got something. And for people who've been told for years that their cancer was just bad luck, having someone acknowledge the truth and pay for it meant more than money could measure. Diana Frost won a Pulitzer for her decades of investigative work. She used the prize money to establish a foundation for environmental journalism. She hired young reporters and taught them how to chase stories that powerful people wanted buried. She called it the Samuel Hartley Foundation. Jack cried when she told him. Marcus Vance recovered from the attack, but never fully. The Parkinson's got worse. His hands shook too much to do field work anymore. But he became an expert witness, testifying in trial after trial, explaining to juries exactly how uranium extraction worked and what it did to land and water and people. He was good at it. Juries believed him because he'd been there, because he'd worked for them and turned against them and paid the price. Sheriff Brennan retired and wrote a book about corruption in law enforcement and how good people could be complicit in terrible things just by following orders. It became required reading at the FBI Academy. And Daniel wrote his book about Samuel Hartley. It took him 3 years. He interviewed everyone he could find. He hiked every trail Samuel had walked. He spent weeks in the cabin trying to understand what 13 years alone in the wilderness did to a man. The book came out in hardcover in 2008 and spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. The title was simple, The Man Who Wouldn't Run. Jack read it in 2 days and then read it again. Daniel had captured something Jack hadn't expected. Not just the facts of what happened, but the cost. The human cost of choosing truth over comfort, of choosing integrity over belonging. It was the story of a man who'd made an impossible choice and lived with it until it killed him. But it was also the story of what came after, of a grandson who found the evidence, and a son who published it, and a family that healed by finally understanding what had been broken. Jennifer called Jack after she finished the book. She said, "Daniel made you a hero in this." Jack said, "I'm not a hero, I just opened a door." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's what heroes do, Jack. They open doors that everyone else walks past. I'm proud of you. I know I didn't say it enough when we were married, but I'm saying it now. Jack sat in his apartment in Seattle, the one he'd gotten after leaving Daniel's couch, and felt something shift that had been stuck for years. He said, "Thank you for that. And Jennifer, I'm sorry for all the ways I failed you, failed us." She said, "We both failed, but we made something good anyway. Look at our son. Look at what he's done. That doesn't happen by accident." They talked for an hour, really talked, for the first time since the divorce. And when they hung up, Jack felt lighter than he had in years. The congressional hearings happened in the summer of 2027. Jack testified alongside Diana and Marcus. They sat at a long table facing senators and cameras, and the kind of formal attention that made everything feel both important and surreal. Jack wore a suit that Daniel had helped him pick out. He felt ridiculous in it, but Daniel said looking the part mattered. Senator Catherine Walsh from Montana led the questioning. She was in her 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She said, "Mr. Hartley, in your opinion, based on everything you've learned about resolve mining and your grandfather's experience, how was this allowed to happen for 70 years?" Jack looked at the microphone in front of him, at the cameras, at the faces of people who had the power to change things if they chose to. He said, "Because the people who knew the truth were afraid to speak, and the people with power to stop it were paid not to care. My grandfather tried. He collected evidence. He documented crimes. And he was made to understand that speaking up would cost him everything. So he disappeared. And the company kept operating because powerful people decided uranium was more important than the law." Senator Walsh leaned forward. "What would you say needs to change to prevent this from happening again?" Jack had thought about this question for months, had talked about it with Daniel and Diana and Marcus, had lost sleep over it. He said, "We need to protect whistleblowers, really protect them. Not with laws that look good on paper, but with enforcement that makes companies afraid to retaliate. We need to make it so that the people who speak up are heroes instead of targets. Because right now, 70 years later, the lesson from my grandfather's life is that telling the truth gets you killed. We need to change that lesson." The chamber was quiet. Senator Walsh nodded slowly. She said, "I think we can agree on that, Mr. Hartley. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for finishing what your grandfather started." The Whistleblower Protection Act of 2028 passed with bipartisan support. It wasn't perfect, but it was stronger than anything that had come before. It included provisions for protected identity, federal witness protection if needed, and severe penalties for corporations that retaliated against employees who reported wrongdoing. President signed it in a ceremony that Jack was invited to, but didn't attend. He watched it on television from his apartment, Daniel sitting beside him. Daniel said, "You should have been there." Jack said, "This isn't about me. It's about making sure the next person who finds evidence doesn't have to disappear into the mountains for 13 years. The law was nicknamed the Hartley Act in the press. Diana called it that in her articles. Marcus called it that in his testimony. And eventually, officially, that's what it became. The Hartley Act, named for a man who died alone in 1967 and had been forgotten by everyone except the grandson who'd found his journal. Jack visited the cabin one last time in the fall of 2028. He'd sold his contracting business, downsized his life, and decided to spend a year in Montana doing something that mattered. He'd partnered with the National Park Service to turn the cabin into an education site, a place where people could come and learn about what happened, about Samuel, about the cost of speaking truth, about why protecting whistleblowers mattered. They'd built a small visitor center a half-mile down the trail, kept the cabin itself exactly as it was. The Park Service had stabilized the structure, fixed the roof, but left everything else untouched. Samuel's books were still on the shelves. His trunk was still in the corner, though the contents had been moved to the Montana Historical Society for preservation. Jack had insisted on one addition. A plaque outside the cabin, bronze simple, with words he'd written and rewritten a dozen times. It read, "Samuel Hartley, 1918-1967, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Father, engineer, whistleblower. He chose truth over safety, integrity over acceptance. And in doing so, he proved that one person willing to stand alone can change the world, even if it takes 70 years. The day they unveiled it, Jack stood with Daniel and Diana and Marcus, who was in a wheelchair now but insisted on being there. A crowd of maybe 50 people had gathered, journalists, environmental activists, former Resolve employees who'd been vindicated by the investigation, family members of people who died from the contamination. And standing at the back, quiet and watching, was Jennifer. Jack saw her and felt his heart do something complicated. She'd driven 6 hours from Seattle, hadn't told him she was coming. She just showed up, the way she used to when they were young, and she'd surprise him by showing up at job sites with lunch. After the ceremony, after the speeches and the photographs and the handshakes, Jack found her standing alone looking at the cabin. He said, "You didn't have to come all this way." She smiled. "Yes, I did. This is important." And Daniel said, "You'd probably be alone after everyone left. He thought you might want company." Jack looked at his son, who was standing with Diana and Marcus, very carefully not looking in their direction. Jennifer said, "He's a good kid. We did something right." Jack said, "You did something right. I was mostly just working." She turned to face him. "We both made mistakes, Jack. But we're here now, and our son wrote a book that's changing laws. And your grandfather's name means something instead of nothing. That's not small." They walked the trail together, not talking much, just being in the same space the way they used to be before everything got complicated. The mountains were turning colors, aspen gold against pine green, against sky so blue it hurt to look at. Jennifer said, "Are you happy here in Montana?" Jack thought about the apartment in Missoula he'd rented, about the work with the Park Service, about the quiet nights and the lack of traffic and the way the stars looked without city lights. He said, "I'm content," which might be better than happy. She nodded. Content is underrated. They reached the visitor center, and she said she needed to head back before dark. They stood by her car, awkward the way divorced people were awkward when they remembered why they'd loved each other once. She said, "Take care of yourself, Jack, and call Daniel Moore. He worries about you." "I will." She got in her car and drove away. Jack watched until the dust settled and the sound of the engine faded. Then he walked back to the cabin and sat on the porch where his grandfather had probably sat 1,000 times, looking at the same mountains, holding the same kind of solitude. He understood now why Samuel had stayed, why he hadn't come back even when it might have been safe. Because once you've lived alone with the truth for long enough, you become someone who can't go back to pretending. You become someone who exists outside the normal world. And maybe that's not tragic. Maybe that's just the price of seeing clearly. The book tour for Daniel's work brought father and son together more than they'd been in years. Daniel did readings in every major city. Jack went to most of them, sitting in the back, watching his son tell Samuel's story to rooms full of strangers who cared about things that mattered. After one reading in Denver, a young woman approached Jack. She was maybe 30, wearing a business suit, carrying a briefcase. She said, "Are you Jack Hartley?" Jack nodded. She said, "I'm a lawyer with the EPA. I specialized in environmental crimes because of your grandfather's story, because of what you and your son did. I wanted you to know that the work continues. We're investigating 12 other cases right now that follow the same pattern. Companies that think they're above the law. And we're using the Hartley Act to protect the people who come forward." Jack shook her hand. "Thank you for that." She said, "No, thank you for showing us that it's possible to win." Those moments happened more than Jack expected. People who'd read Daniel's book, people who'd been inspired by Samuel's story, people who'd decided that speaking up was worth the risk. Each time it happened, Jack felt the weight he'd been carrying get a little lighter. 5 years after finding the cabin, Jack stood at the cemetery again. This time he wasn't alone. Daniel was there with his new wife, Sarah, who was 7 months pregnant. Diana was there with her partner, a retired judge who'd helped prosecute some of the resolved cases. Marcus was there in his wheelchair, thinner now but still sharp-eyed. Sheriff Brennan was there, retired and gray, but still standing straight. They'd come to dedicate a proper headstone. The old marker with just initials was being preserved, moved to the Montana Historical Society. In its place, they'd installed granite, polished and permanent. It read, "Samuel Hartley, 1918-1967. Beloved father, devoted engineer, courageous whistleblower. The truth always waits for someone brave enough to speak it." Below that, they'd added something else. A list of names, 23 people who died from Resolve's contamination between 1951 and 1967. The ones Samuel had tried to save and couldn't. Now their names were here too, remembered and honored. The ceremony was small. A pastor from Missoula said a few words about sacrifice and legacy. Diana read from Samuel's journal, the entry about hoping his family would forgive him. Daniel spoke about his grandfather's life, about the man he'd learned about through interviews and documents, and the echo of choices that rippled through generations. And Jack, when it was his turn to speak, said only this: "I never met my grandfather. He died years before I was born. But I know him through what he left behind, through the evidence he preserved, through the choice he made to stand alone rather than stand down. We're here today because 70 years ago, one man decided that truth mattered more than comfort, that integrity mattered more than safety. He paid for that decision with everything he had. But because of him, laws changed, lives were saved, and justice, even when it comes late, still comes." He paused, looking at the granite marker. "So this isn't goodbye, Grandpa Samuel. This is thank you. Thank you for not running. Thank you for holding on. Thank you for believing that someone would come along who'd finish what you started. We did, and we'll make sure nobody has to make the choice you made. Not alone, not anymore." There wasn't a dry eye at the graveside. Even Marcus, who claimed he'd lost the ability to cry years ago, had tears tracking down his weathered face. After everyone else had left, Jack stayed. He sat with his back against the new headstone, looking at the mountains his grandfather had known so well. Daniel's daughter would be born in 2 months. They were going to name her Samantha. After Samuel, another generation carrying the name forward, carrying the story. Jack thought about the compass he'd left on the old marker 5 years ago. The Park Service had recovered it, put it in a display case in the visitor center. But in his mind, it was still here, still pointing north, still true. His phone buzzed, a text from Daniel. "Dad, Sarah and I want you to move back to Seattle. Be close when the baby comes. You've done enough in Montana. Come home." Jack looked at the message for a long time. Home. Seattle had been home once, then it hadn't. Then Montana had been something like home. But maybe home wasn't a place. Maybe it was just being near the people who mattered. He typed back, "I'll think about it." But he already knew the answer. His work here was done. The cabin was preserved. The story was told. The laws were changed. Samuel's name meant something instead of nothing. It was time to go back to being a grandfather instead of a historian. Time to teach his granddaughter the things he'd taught Daniel. How to use a level. How to shake hands like you meant it. How to stand for something even when standing cost everything. He stood up, bones creaking the way they did when you were 57 and had spent too much time in the cold. He put his hand on the headstone one more time. He said, "I'm going to go be with family now, but I'll come back. Make sure they're taking care of this place. Make sure people remember." The wind moved through the pines. The same wind that had moved through them for 100 years, for 1,000. The same wind Samuel had heard in his last days. Jack walked back down the trail toward his truck, toward the future, toward his son and the granddaughter he hadn't met yet, and the life that was waiting for him to step back into it. Behind him, the mountains kept their vigil, patient and permanent, holding stories in stone and pine and the bones of men who'd chosen hard truths over easy lies. Samuel Hartley's story was told now, published and preserved and passed into history. But the lesson lived on. In the laws that protected whistleblowers, in the people who chose courage over comfort, in the grandson who'd found a cabin and opened a door and followed the truth all the way to the end. Some legacies are measured in money, some in monuments. Samuel Hartley's legacy was measured in the people who came after him, who knew his name, who understood his choice, who carried forward the simple, terrible, necessary truth that had cost him everything. One person, standing alone, can change the world. It just takes longer than one lifetime. But it happens, if you're willing to wait. And if someone, someday, is willing to finish what you started. Jack Hartley drove down the mountain as the sun set behind him, painting the sky in colors that looked like fire and gold and promise. His phone rang. "Daniel." He answered. Daniel said, "Did you get my text?" Jack said, "I did. Tell Sarah I'm coming home. I want to be there when my granddaughter is born. I want to tell her about her great-great-grandfather, about the man she's named for." Daniel's voice was thick. "She's going to love that story." Jack said, "It's a good story, about a good man who made hard choices, about truth and sacrifice and why integrity matters. Every kid should hear a story like that." "See you soon, Dad." "See you soon." Jack hung up and drove into the gathering dark, the mountains behind him and his family ahead. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt complete. The story that started in 1953 with a man walking into the wilderness had ended, but the legacy would go on, generation after generation. Truth passed like fire from hand to hand, never burning out, always lighting the way forward, for anyone brave enough to carry it. The end.